In this video, we're going to look at a standing hip car against a squat rack or a frame of some sort. Now, the idea with this movement is we are going to be able to limit any sort of compensations that may be occurring when we're performing our hip car. And some typical compensations are when we go through the hip car motion, we might find to some degree that there's excessive movement coming from the pelvis or even potentially coming from the spine where we rotate. And what we want to do with this variation is pull ourselves into the frame so that we limit any sort of rotation purely down to the fact that we have some tactile feedback, we have something that we're actually kind of holding on to, and we're just getting more awareness of our trunk position, our pelvic position, so that we can really isolate just the hip joint and solely move through that hip joint. So really important when we're trying to move the hip that we're not getting any sort of pelvic movement, or we're not moving the spine, turning to the side, flexing, bending from any other joints when, as I said, we're trying to isolate that hip, okay? The actual movement itself then, in terms of setup, what you want to make sure is that you're getting yourself set up so that you've got the lateral side of your hip as opposed to, say, like the front of the hip in contact with the frame. You want to get most kind of to the side, kind of dead on in contact with the frame. You then want to wrap your arm around. You can wrap on and kind of hug onto what would be like your ribs, or you can just grab onto your other arm and sort of grip the two together so that you can pull in and get some nice tension with your upper body. Nice and long with the spine, even squeezing that kind of right bum cheek or that kind of standing leg so that you get a lot of stiffness through it. And as I said, pulling that hip in contact with the frame and trying to keep contact throughout. You're then going to take a big breath in, inhale, irradiate, go through that kind of irradiation procedure where we would take that air, pack it into our lower abdomen, and then stiffen and tighten around it. And then by stiffening and tightening all of the musculature of the body, remember that irradiation process involves all of the musculature of the body, we now have a good position so that when we go to perform that hip car, we now know that it's only coming through the hip. We obviously still have to be conscious and aware of excessive movement happening, so let's keep that in mind as we go through the motion. Now, the first thing that we want to do is we want to actually adduct across ourselves, and that involves sort of scooping the leg over and sort of getting as much movement across the hip as possible. So that kind of shortening angle, knee across the body. And you can see what we're also going to do as well is we're going to slightly externally rotate the hip. So if this was neutral, this would be internal rotation. This would be external rotation. We're actually going to go with the two of those movements before we then come up into flexion as far as we can. You can see that idea of I'm trying to bring my knee to my chest as high as I can, focusing on it coming from the hip joint. I haven't just shortened. So the idea this frame is going to help us get an idea of any other areas kind of contributing to the movement. We then abduct out to the side as far as we can go and as high as we can go in hip flexion. From here, now we have to internally rotate the hip. Remember, what I'd say here is be really conscious of movement from the pelvis versus movement from the actual hip joint. So that idea of pulling yourself into the frame is going to be super important at this portion here. When we go into internal rotation, we then continue into extension of the hip. So I squeeze my bum to kind of squeeze back, get lots of tension in my bum cheek, and then from here I adduct and I bring the leg and foot down at the same time. I'll then come up a little bit to now reverse it. I then go into extension. I squeeze my bum and I kick back. I then go into abduction, so my knee and my foot coming up at the same time, really isolating that lateral side of the hip and not just flexing at my trunk in any way. So I really have to feel all of this tissue on the outside of the hip contract. I then go into external rotation. So I try to think of the hip bone within the socket driving into external rotation. That would involve my foot coming through and then into flexion where my knee comes up. So you can see this moving from here, from abduction all the way through into flexion. I'm in an abducted position now. I just want to come across the body and then I go back to my start position. All together, it's going to look like this. So external rotation into adduction, up into flexion, out into abduction. Internally rotate as we go back into extension. Keep that contact with the hip. Perfect. Now put it in reverse. Extend, abduct, externally rotate as we flex up towards the armpit, across the body, and perfect. So you're going to find with this variation, it's going to be really, really useful and beneficial to really get a high degree of irradiation, something that you might not have experienced when doing other car variations like a side-lying version or a quadruped version of the hip car. So with this, you're really going to be able to maximize that level of internal tension in the body and really gain a lot of benefit. This might be something I have tagged on after some hip PAILs rails work, whether it be adduction, abduction, internal, external rotation. This is a great way to just now explore that newfound territory and really start to question at what point the hip is moving. Maybe the pelvis is moving at a certain point, and I've pointed that out in some previous comments of you performing movements. So bear all of these notes in mind when you're going through that hip car, that you should always be conscious of what's moving, really sort of searching, scanning, and feeling for any excess movement or compensations from other areas that shouldn't be contributing to the movements. All right, there's a lot of detail in that video, so of course if you have any questions, be sure to leave it below in the comment section. Be sure to like the video and subscribe to the page as well if you want to see more content like this on a regular basis. For the moment though, thanks, and I'll see you soon.